at the discretion of everyone above me. So judge, opponent's partner, ready?
Yes, ready.
I am ready.
Perfect. Before I begin, I'd just like to mention both my partner and I would prefer to take POIs on the raise hand feature in Zoom instead of a verbal interruption. So if the opponents could do that, that would be great.
Okay. For us, could you just do it verbally? Because I won't be looking at the screen, neither will my partner.
Sure.
Okay, sounds good.
And if I don't respond to the raise hand within like 15 or 20 seconds, just feel free to interrupt me. Okay, but that's out of the way. I can begin my speech. So my time will start now. We strongly affirm the resolution that this House would not impose life sentences for any crime. First, let's start with some definitions and framing. This House is the US judicial system. We define would as willing to do so if the ability were to be there. We define life sentences as a sentence condemning a convicted felon to spend the rest of his or her life in prison without parole. The burden for the government in this debate is to prove that life sentences cause more harm than good to the prisoners and prison system, and the burden for the opposition is to prove that life sentences cause more good than harm to the prisoners and prison system. So now that the framework has been laid out, let's get into the arguments. Contention 1, life sentences defeat the purpose of prisons. Prisons are mainly for rehabilitation, both in the United States and internationally. The basic idea of rehabilitation through imprisonment is that a person who has been incarcerated will never want to be sent back to prison after they've been set free. The goal is that an inmate's experience while locked up will leave a lasting impression that a former prisoner will do whatever it takes to avoid a second term. And this is working because in an effort to offer better rehabilitative services to the inmates, many prisons have begun providing some psychiatrists to help deal with prisoners' mental disorder and psychological issues. Prisons even offer classroom settings in which inmates can learn to read and educate themselves. These methods are proven to have a positive effect on the prisoners and have helped many to overcome a background with little or no education. Upon their release, the prisoners who have stuck with these programs are given a better opportunity to succeed and become law-abiding citizens. In the US, this is the goal, and this is what we want to do with every prisoner who enters our legal system. But the problem is, life prison sentences are increasing. Before America's era of mass incarceration took hold in the early 70s, the number of individuals in prison was less than 200,000. Today, it's 1.4 million, and more than 200,000 people are serving life sentences alone. That's one out of every 7 in prison that are serving life sentences with no option in parole. And this is a huge problem because if you have a life sentence without parole, it completely defeats the point of rehabilitation, since these prisoners are never given the opportunity to go back in society and make a difference, to make change. There's no point of going to prison if you know you're going to stay there until you die. Furthermore, life without parole has even been compared to the death penalty and has many of the same qualities that's making the death penalty be banned in many states right now. Capital punishment is riddled with racial disparities, flawed science, and a legal system that routinely fails the marginalized. These exact same flaws exist across the whole system because, looked at logically, staying alive, even in prison, has to be a better outcome than being executed. But if you look at it more closely, is the lesser sentence really better than the harshest one? Many experts agree that it's not. Life sentences are not a humane alternative to the death penalty. So life sentences are increasing, and they go against the very point of prison's rehabilitation. The impact of this is that the cost of one inmate per year in prison is up to $69,000 for one inmate. We are putting more and more prisoners into this system that goes against the entire point of prison with no ability for coming back to society. And it's costing the federal government over $69,000 per year on these inmates who are just sentenced to die. This is both bad for the prison system, bad for the federal government, and bad for prisoners, as I'm going to get into in my second contention. So contention 2 is that it's inhumane for prisoners. The European Committee for the Prevention of Torture has found that in European states, life sentence prisoners are kept separate as a rule and are subjected to systematic handcuffing and strip searches and are escorted from their cells with guard dogs. A testimony from a prisoner serving life without parole has stated life in prison is a slow, torturous death. Maybe it would have been better if they just given me the electric chair and ended my life instead of a life sentence, letting me rot away in jail. It serves no purpose and becomes a burden on everybody. This encapsulates the very problem with life for life imprisonment sentences. Because influenced by enormous corporate lobbying, the United States Congress enacted the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program, which permitted US companies to use prison laborers. Coupled with a drastic increase in the prison population during this time, profits for participating companies and revenue for the government and its private contractors soared. And these exploited laborers are disproportionately African American and Latino, a demographic status quo resulting from this unjust sentences and other criminal justice policies which hurt minorities. So the United States is locking up people of color at alarming rates. And because of this, it's simply inhumane for prisoners, not just for people in color, but the prison system in the United States right now is so bad, it's equivalent to torture. So when you look at the impacts of this, it's obviously bad for the prisoners. If they're going into life without parole in prison with no chance of getting back on their feet and going through extreme mental trauma and anguish. And the impact of this is that obviously prisoners are going through such bad times, but the government is paying for them. Like we said earlier, they're paying over $69,000 a year just for them to be in prison. So this is not justice. This is pure torture because it's not serving any benefit to society. Normally in prison, prisoners have the opportunity to redeem themselves once they come outside. But in this case, it simply does not happen. And I'd like to reiterate the fact once more that it's being compared to the death penalty. I think many of us would agree, and many US states are agreeing, that the death penalty is abhorrent and should be outlawed in all states. But this displays some the main qualities of the death penalty, except it's even worse because the US federal government has to pay so much money to keep these prisoners in jail. So to recap these contentions, it defeats the purpose of prisons because of the lack of rehabilitation, and it's inhumane for prisoners. So, Judge, if you believe in a world where people are able to get back on their feet once they've committed a crime, where people, especially younger people, that go to prison don't have to waste their entire life away in prison and have a chance to come back and make a meaningful impact on society, vote for the government that this House would not impose life sentences for any crimes. Thank you.
Great speech. I have 8 minutes. My name is Melanie Goldberg, and just for a quick off-time roadmap, which is just like me explaining what I'm going to do in my speech, just like the taglines. So I'm going to be quickly going into the definitions just so we have a foundation. Then I'm going to be doing 2 negation contentions, and then I'll be going over the, I think it was the 2 or the multiple affirmation contentions. Okay. And once again, if you guys have POIs, please just call them out verbally. I won't be looking at the screen. All right. My time begins in 3, 2, 1. Hello, Judge. My name is Melanie Goldberg, and I strongly negate the resolution that was previously stated in today's debate round. Okay, so I just want to get into the definitions. We agree with the definition of this house and the definition of would, but we want to challenge the definition of the life sentences. My opponents basically state that a life sentence is prison without parole. They don't really define this, but Judge, if you actually look up what a life sentence is, a life sentences are generally, you are sentenced to prison. There are kind of 2 different ways, either a life without parole or you have a life sentence up to 15 to 25 years, and then you get parole. So it kind of goes both ways, and it's kind of like 50-50, but life sentences are not solely without parole. There are tons and tons of cases, and most of which are with parole. Look at the fact that their definition accounts for only a small number of life sentences. We don't have a specific statistic because we thought it was genuine knowledge and common that life sentences include parole. And although it's surprising to hear the word life sentence and then to know that you might get let out 25 years later, that is what a life sentence is under the US. So yeah, you should just not count their definition. So let's get into the first contention, which is going to be, just a quick trigger warning, Judge or anyone in today's debate round, if you guys have any problem with the following topics, please stop me now and I will not mention them, including rape and violence. Okay, sounds like everyone's good. So I'm going to go into the first contention, which is on repeat offenses and deterrence. The claim is that people who are sentenced to live for crimes by the legal system are in prison for a reason. Life sentences are a form of punishment and significantly deter crime and repeat offenders. So let's go into the warrants. The first warrant is going to be deterrence from long sentences. So studies show that longer prison sentences deter crime from being committed, saving innocent lives. For example, California's violent crime rate fell because of the passage of California's Proposition 8, which is increased sentences for repeat offenders who commit murder, rape, and robbery. So basically, when we see that prison sentences are increased, we're actually seeing that less people commit crimes. Then the second warrant, which is going to be on reoffenders. So A, offenders who have served longer prison terms tend to be older released and less likely to reoffend regardless of their imprisonment experience. B, studies have found that people almost always age out of crime, particularly by their late 30s and 40s. If a person is locked up for robbery or murder at 21 years old, there's a very good chance that he won't commit that same crime when he gets out at 41, according to Vox, which is a really reputable source. C, once released, however, the vast majority of life prisoners are successfully integrated back into the community. This counters all of my opponent's points about the lack of integration, because only 2.2% of those sentenced to a mandatory life sentence and 4.8% of those serving other life sentences end up reoffending in any way. So we're basically seeing like a 96% rate people who serve life sentences get out and never reoffend. We're seeing them actually be very successful. And then we look at the general public and we're seeing a large 50% of the overall prison population and people that are incarcerated, 50% end up reoffending. So we're seeing the difference between the effectiveness of reoffenders in terms of life in prison or life sentence. And then we're seeing the general population in prison, which is around 96% don't offend and 50%. We're seeing a massive difference, and we're seeing the effectiveness of this life in prison. The third warrant is punishment. Prison is an important option for incapacitating and punishing those who commit crimes. And it's really important to show that. The impacts of this, one, or why this matters. Life imprisonment massively deters crime and reoffenders. I give you all these statistics in my case. We specifically compare the life imprisonment to a regular jail and show the beneficial outcomes. Without life imprisonment, more people will commit crimes successfully and in general. And 3, the justice system allows for fair punishment of criminals. Okay, so Judge, overall, what we're saying is that life imprisonment basically deters crime, it deters repeat offenders, and it's a fair punishment. Going into the second contention, death or little prison. Claim, without the option of a life in prison with or without parole, judges are put in a difficult position. They must either sentence the defendant to a small number of years in prison or an extremely light sentence relative to their crime, or they must put the defendant to death. Warrants. 1, increase in death penalty cases. When the judge no longer had the option to send defendants to life in prison, they'll sentence most severe criminals to death. So murderers and other severe criminals whom the judge dislikes are much more likely to be put to death. This means that there will likely be racial and socioeconomic factors at play. People of color have accounted for a disproportionate 43% of total executions since 1976, and 55% of those currently awaiting execution. We're going to see these trends continue if you vote for the affirmation. 2, while victims account for approximately 1/2 of all murder victims, 80% of all capital cases involve white victims. Furthermore, as of October 2002, 12 people have been executed where the defendant was white and the murder victim was Black, compared with 178 Black defendants executed for murder with white victims. I'm so sorry, I only have like 2 minutes and I still have to get through the rest of my case encounter. I'll answer if I have time. All of the above warrants just mean that the judge is more likely to be biased against minority defendants who commit serious crimes. And as such, we likely will see severe persecution of these defendants, and systemic racism will be at play as well. 2 is we're going to be seeing low prison sentences. So the converse of this is that low prison sentences mean that violent criminals are released early without having served full sentences, and like we said, 50% of these people are going to reoffend. So we're going to see even bigger and more impactful crime. And this is going to cause a massive issue because without a life sentence, we see that people who are reoffend are subject to the same problem as before. And we're going to see prison have an even less impact. Then onto the impacts, or why this matters. This is going to be a lack of deterrence. And we tell you that the death penalty is super bad. And we tell you that it's basically racist, and it's very disproportionately affecting minorities. We're telling you that 1 in 10 people who are executed by the death penalty are literally innocent, and it is very, very horrible. So we're either sentencing to people to commit more crimes because they're let out early, or people die and they are proven innocent, and it disproportionately affects minorities. So going on to the affirmations case. Okay, on to their first contention. You can cross-apply our second contention. The alternative is simply worse. Then they talk about prisons are mainly for rehabilitation. We see that people who serve life sentences like 20 years are no longer repeat offenders. That is rehabilitation at its finest. That is the epitome of it. But what's not the epitome? What's not the best example, Judge? That's not the best example. That 50% of people that actually go to prison in regular time, and not including life imprisonment, are 50% are reoffending. So we actually see this more as a turn for the affirmation. Then they talk about inmates being locked up. Then why do 50% of prisoners become repeat offenders? Then they talk about vast increase for people with life sentences. Again, parole for most. They said there's no point in going to prison if you know you're going to stay there until you die. Yes, there is. You can live out your life in an environment where you can be safe and no longer be a danger to yourself or to others. That is the system on which the United States is fundamentally based on. Then on their second argument, they talk about how the cost of one inmate per year is $69,000. I highly doubt that, as there are like over 200,000 people serving life sentences. But anyways, even if you think that's true, we're paying money so that a rapist can't go out and cause another person trauma. I'm okay with that. Like, we are really, also the cost of the federal government is basically able to pay for this. I don't have a lot of time to get into the rest of the counters, but Judge, for all of these reasons about countering both of their points, and the fact that you have to buy the fact that life imprisonment is basically preventing deterrence and preventing repeat offenders, you should be voting for the negation side of today's debate round. Thank you so much.
All right, so I am the second speaker of the government. Opponents ready? Partner, ready? Yeah. Judges at your discretion. I'm going to start my 8 minutes now. So first, I just want to go through, I want to go into the burdens and the definitions arguments of this round. And then if time permits, or after burdens and definitions, I'm going to go into my opponent's claims, their rebuttals to our points, and then if time permits, I'm going to go on to their off case. So first of all, I want to talk about the burden of this round, which my opponents have conceded to, they have accepted, which is the burden of the government is life sentences cause more harm than good to the prisoner and the prison system. And then the burden of the opposition is life sentences cause more good than harm to prisoners and the prison system. My opponents accepted those definitions, so we're going to keep that in mind throughout the entire rest of this round. Then moving on to the topicality issue that my opponents have brought up about life sentences and how it shouldn't be a full life sentence. However, Judge, we're here to define a life sentence as a sentence that is for the rest of their life without parole, as 25% of all supposed life sentence, I mean, like of the 200,000 people that are given a government life sentence is a life without parole. And this is what should be weighed in this round, as that is who is getting the biggest impact of this resolution. So for these reasons, you should support our definition of a life sentence, which is a life sentence condemning a convicted felon to spend the rest of his or her life in prison without parole. Now, moving on to their points, which is longer sentences equals less crimes. However, Judge, this is an issue that we have to face head on, because it's not that the longer sentences are good for society, but it's that longer sentences are extremely inhumane for prisoners. And that's what the burden is for this round. So as we see, the prison life is extremely torturing and is extremely detrimental to the mental strain and mental ability of these prisoners. 24,000 prisoners across 29 prisons in 12 states protested against inhumane conditions. And out of the top 20 most inhumane prisons in the world, 4 of them are American prisons, and 2 of which are in the top 10 of most inhumane prisons in the world. So it's extremely inhumane American prisons are extremely inhumane and are really bad for the mentality of prisons, and longer sentences that my opponents claim are better for and will reduce less crimes also lead to prison crowding. So if we have longer and longer sentences, which we see as a growing trend in the US, we will lead to prison crowding, and thus it will make even worse. It will make it even worse for prisoners themselves, as the impact of this is that it's going to make the prison system even more inhumane for prisoners. So current prison system has been simile to has been like it has been it's been sorry prison system like prisoners are exploited laborers that are disproportionately African American and Latino, and a demographic status quo resulting from sentencing and other criminal justice policies ransacking minority communities across the United States. African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times more higher than whites, meaning that the prison system is not only inhumane, but it's disproportionately affecting African Americans. So we're going to be locking up more and more African Americans for longer and longer periods of time, leading to prison crowding, which we're seeing as a really, really big issue during the COVID-19 pandemic, as there are even more and more prisons that are unable to cope with the high numbers and high COVID-19 numbers. So if you take this into account, it's extremely detrimental for the mental health and physical health of prison systems. Sentencing people in prison for a long time does not reduce crime. In fact, longer sentences, if anything, will create crime. And numerous studies on the impact of incarceration concluded that aftermath of a prison sentence, especially a long one, someone is made more likely to commit a crime than they would have otherwise, as it is messing with their head, as they're in this basically a cell filled with many, many, many people all the time. Not only are lengthy prison sentences ineffective at reducing crimes, but they have devastated low-income minority communities. As Vera Institute aptly put it, we have lost generations of young men and women, particularly young men of color, to long, brutal prison terms. While Black people are just 13% of the country's population, they account for 40% of people we incarcerate. And the ineffectiveness of long prison terms, or the impact of on poor communities of color is not reason enough to revisit lengthy prison sentences. The financial drain of long prison sentences is staggering. For example, U.S. prisons spend $16 billion per year on elder care alone. Billions of dollars diverted to prisons to take care of elderly who would pose no real risk if released. That money could be going towards schools, hospitals, and communities. So if you take this, for example, my opponents say, oh, I would not mind spending $69,000 a year to keep a rapist out of society. However, you are also losing $69,000 a year per inmate on for something that could be used for a much better good, especially for education and schools. We're not addressing the root problem here, Judge. It is an issue that is systemic throughout the entire US judicial system, and it must be reduced at the root end, which is then spending more money on schools and spending more money on education to then reduce the number of people that are actually committing these crimes in the first place. If we're spending more and more money on prisons and more money on putting more people in prison, then you're going to be not addressing the issue, but trying to put a Band-Aid over a gunshot wound. So you won't actually be stopping the issue, you'll just be further exacerbating it. So longer prison sentences do not include less crimes. Life sentences do not work, and prisons are extremely dangerous. My opponents say that, oh, it's better for someone who's a convicted rapist or murderer to stay in prison as they don't hurt anyone else or hurt themselves. However, prison is extremely dangerous, especially for people that have committed gruesome crimes. Trigger warning, just in case you're not okay with rape or child abuse. But if there is a prisoner who is convicted of raping or killing, or a pedophile that is in prison, they're subject to extremely harsh conditions from the other inmates. So prison is actually not safe for them, and it's not safe for them to have life sentences there. It's bad for them. It's bad for the society if they ever get released, and it's bad for the entire prison system because they're unable to sustain such high expenses. So for these reasons and many more, I strongly urge a gov ballot. Thank you, Judge.
Okay, sorry. I'm so used to everything being on tab that it's a little weird to switch over to Zoom. So in terms of off-time roadmap, it's going to be first definition of burdens, second off or negation case, third on or affirmation case. And at the end, if I have time, I'm going to be going over impact weighing and general round strategy to set up the LOR. Okay, if anybody is not ready, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1, begin. First, let's talk about the definitions in this round. We contest this definition of life sentence because they define it as prison without parole, right? And we tell you that, in fact, life sentences are generally with parole after 15 to 25 years. This is according to, the general base of what the US law dictates. As a result, therefore, it is unfair for them to exclude a small portion of the topic, a significant portion of the topic in order to favor a small portion to give themselves a competitive advantage with this foreground in this debate, right, Judge? Look at the fact that their definition accounts for a small number of life sentences, right? The amount of people who are put in prison without parole for a life sentence is a very small proportion of the people who are put in prison for life sentences overall. And as such, to exclude people who are put into prison with parole from this discussion is to exclude the majority of the issue and to make it so that we cannot debate this resolution to its fullest. We tell you that their definition is abusive. We tell you that it excludes a significant part of what the topic really is saying. And all they say in response is that the majority of people are without parole. First of all, I suspect that that's not true. I don't know the statistic, but I would suspect that very few people are put into prison without parole. But even if they are, it is still absurd to say that we are going to exclude the people who are put in prison with parole, that we're not even going to consider their lives because they are a small proportion of the overall population. Okay, so that's one on definitions. We just win this definition off the bat because we claim abuse and they don't give you a substantive reason. They don't give you a substantive refutation to our views, and B, they don't give you a substantive reason why their definition is uniquely good. 2, let's move into the burdens. They define the burdens in the round as basically what is best for prison and the prison system. We're going to contest this. Why? Because what is best for prison and the prison system doesn't address the fundamental object of the objective of prison and the prison system, which is to protect society. Therefore, in an equation where we're talking about criminal justice, we must take society into account, right, Judge? So what are we going to define it as? Well, our kind of definition is we're just going to do net benefits for the most people. So whichever team can prove that they cause the most good for the most amount of people should win today's debate round. That includes their definition. It gives them all the ground that they need, but it also means that we're talking about the issue as a whole instead of a small portion of it, right? Okay, and then even if you don't buy that the objective of the prison system is to protect society. The reason that the prison system exists is to protect society. So even if you don't buy our burdens, we still consider impacts that relate to society because you're considering what is good for the prison system. What is good for the prison system is what helps the prison system achieve its goal. Its goal is to protect society. Let's get into the neg case. So going down the neg case, first of all, our contention about repeat offenders and deterrence. They say longer sentences are inhumane for prisoners. They lead to prison clouding and exploited laborers. There are exploited laborers in prison who are people of color and Latinos in the majority. Let's talk about a couple refutations to this. Refutation number 1. On the prison crowding point. The prison crowding point is non-unique, right? The proportion of prisoners who serve life sentences to the overall prison population is very small. That means that even if you were to get rid of every single prisoner who's serving a life sentence today, I need to get there. Even if you were to get rid of every single prisoner who is serving a life sentence today, this minute, you would still not solve the problem of prison overcrowding. Even if you were to get rid of double the amount of prisoners who are currently serving life sentences, you would still not solve the problem of prison overcrowding. We see that inherently, this is a non-unique issue. They talk about how there are exploited laborers that are POC. I'll take it at the end of this point if I have time. We see that there are exploited laborers, right, who are people of color, who are Latino. Again, this is non-unique. Again, most people who are serving prison sentences are going to be doing this labor anyway. The small difference in years is the small difference in years between a normal prison sentence and a life sentence, right, for most individuals will not account for a substantial portion of the hours worked by exploited labor. So we see it, this is not a very big impact in the debate, if it is an impact in the debate at all, because what we see is that the negation side has greater harms when it comes to minority groups. Why? Because of the death penalty. We tell you that the death penalty means, and this goes unrefuted, that the death penalty means that minorities in the United States are going to be persecuted and they are going to be sentenced to death by judges. We give you warrants on how this has happened in the past. We tell you that since 1978, a huge proportion of defendants who were sentenced to death, a huge proportion of those people were Black, as a disproportionate number relative to their percentage of the population, relative to the number of criminals who were indicted, right? We see that this means that minorities are going to be put to death at a disproportionate rate, and that must outweigh any kind of impact relating to people being forced to do forced labor, because honestly, death is irreversible. Forced labor is not, right? And ultimately, I think it's pretty common sense that death has a much greater magnitude than forced labor. Okay, moving down the flow. So we talk, and then they talk about how there's this terrible financial drain. A couple refutations here. Number one, it doesn't matter. We did the math. If you were to, the average American pays $41 a year for the entire life sentence system, right? And even on a much larger scale, we see that the amount of money that the US government is spending is completely insignificant compared to the national debt and compared to the United States' GDP. We see that it is a negligible cost to the United States federal government and to state governments to keep life prisoners in prison. And we also see that life prisoners are such a small proportion of the prison population that getting rid of them wouldn't really have any effect on the amount of money we're spending in total. Therefore, disregard this argument about draining the coffers. They tell you that this money could be used to do things like education, but they cannot prove that the money, even if that money were to be saved, that it would go to education. They cannot prove that they gain any benefit out of that because it could be allocated anywhere. It could be allocated to tax cuts for all we know. So don't give them any offense on that point. Okay. Let's talk about the second disadvantage, because they drop it. It is conceded, and it is the key point of offense in this round because it is the only conceded point of offense in this round. It is the most important point of offense in this round. Why? Because we are the only team that access death, and we do it with the second disadvantage. And at the point at which you access death and we win the impact of death uniquely in the round, we win the round. The second contention tells you that if there are no life sentences, judges will have to do one of two things. Judges will either have to sentence inmates to death or sentence them to low prison sentences, which they will subsequently be released from, go into society and commit more crimes, many of which are murder. Therefore, we have an unrefuted link chain that gives us access to death impacts. Those are the only death impacts in the round, and they are the most important impacts in the round because death is irreversible and it has the greatest magnitude of any impact. Okay, moving on to the affirmations case in the last little bit of my speech. Okay, we give you a bunch of affirmations here that go dropped. First of all, we tell you that their case has a double bind, right? Because they tell you on one hand that prisons are really, really good. They tell you that prisons are good at rehabilitating people, but on the other hand, they tell you it's a torturous existence. If they're really good at rehabilitating people and they tell you they have psychiatrists, they have systems in place to give people a better life when they get out, then how is it possible that it is also a torturous experience? If it's a torturous experience, then prisons were failing at their goal in the first place. Right? Finally, we see that all of my partners' reputations on the affirmation case have been totally conceded. They were not at all addressed by the MG. This means that at the very least, you should vote for the risk of solvency for the negation on the second disadvantage. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, I'm also adjusting to the whole Zoom versus tab thing. Took me a second to realize we were not on tab. Okay, I have for a quick off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going into the definitions, minorities, prison overcrowding rates, life sentences are effective, and then I'll be talking about death penalty and smaller sentencing. Okay, for 4 minutes, my time begins in 3, 2, 1. Judge, You will be voting for the negation side in today's debate round on the definitions debate. Here we go. My opponents bring up two abusive definitions. The first one is that life sentence is prison without parole, and that we should solely be debating about the impacts towards the prison system and the people within it. The reason why the first life sentence with prison without parole is actually literally abusive is because they exclude arguments. They exclude the most massive chunk of life sentences, which are 15 or 25 years, and then they get access to parole. So my opponents in their speech, when we bring this up, they just reiterate their original definition and provide no reason why our new definition is unfair. Thus, Judge, based off of that, you must vote for the negation on this specific definition because it's conceded. Next, on the solely debating about impacts, once again, we see that the affirmation is limiting arguments to a specific region and excluding the impacts of the negation. If we are talking about the US, then it should be impacts to the US. The point of prison is to protect society. So we need to relate the impacts of prison to society. And you can apply what my partner said about how even if you don't buy that, societal impacts are still at play. Okay. Judge, you should not be voting on these abusive definitions because it will perpetuate them into the next round. On the main four voter issues on minorities, the minorities are disproportionately harmed more under the affirmation. Yes, Judge, we agree that the prison system is inherently racist, but there will be more racism under the affirmation because people will be sentenced to death at a higher rate, which already disproportionately affects minorities and will increase that trend and continue it. We see that this argument was completely unrefuted. That means that my opponents agree with the fact that they are perpetuating increased amounts of racism. Judge, you should not be voting for a team that agrees that their own policy is perpetuating the cycle of racism. Next, on overcrowding prison and rates. We calculated that it's $41 per person per jail for everyone in jail per year. It's 200,000 times 69,000 divided by 330 million. We're telling you that that is not a lot of money to keep a rapist from raping someone again, to keep a murderer from murdering another child, to keep a family abuser away from their children. We're seeing that those are way bigger impacts than a mere $41. Then we tell you that life sentences are not the majority of jail. When they talk about overcrowding, not solving for overcrowding at all. They are also, the other counter to this is that they are feeding a symptom of the main disease that is causing overcrowding. The main problem with overcrowding is that we are seeing so many people committing crimes. This is not happening in other countries. To solve overcrowding, we have to decrease crime in and of itself, and cutting out life sentences is not going to decrease crime. In fact, it's going to actually put more people in prison because we're going to be seeing repeat offenders more consistently. Now, why are we going to be seeing more repeat offenders? That brings me to my third voter issue on how life sentences are consistently effective. My opponents drop this argument that only 2.2% to 4.8% of life sentence individuals end up repeating a crime after they are let out of jail. But 50% of prisoners who are put in jail repeat their crime. This means that we're seeing that when people are put in life in prison, when they have a life sentence served to them, they actually end up committing less crime. This means that we're going to be seeing less people in prison. So if you really want to know who's solving for overcrowding and these rates, we're going to be seeing less people in prison on the negation side. Okay, now on to the biggest impact, which is on the death penalty and smaller sentencing. If there is no life sentence, a judge now has two choices: death sentence or really, really small prison time. If someone has murdered someone, or if someone has committed a bad crime that would originally be multiple life sentences, now they're sentenced to death. We're seeing a massive increase in the only irreversible impact in this round. And Judge, on the basis of racism, on the basis of death, you should be voting for the negation in today's debate round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. I'm Harvest Nathan, and I'll be the final speaker for the government side. Is everyone ready for me to begin my speech? All right, perfect. A brief off-time rollback. In this speech, I'll basically go over the main points of clash in today's debate and explain the impacts and why we come out on top in each of them, and ultimately why we win the debate. So I will start my time now. So the first major issue in this was the topicality and the voting. And while we don't fully concede to our opponent's claims we recognize that even if they added prison without or prison with parole to the definition of life sentence and added their definition to the burden, it wouldn't change much for our case. So we'll argue on both terms today. So first, their main contention is that repeat offense is about repeat offenses and deterrence. They say that life sentences, which in their definition is basically longer sentences, are actually deter criminals from going back out and repeating their crimes. But to this, they mainly use empirical evidence, which is frowned upon in this style of parley debate, and cited evidence should not be weighed more than uncited evidence. So my partner has explained logically why shorter sentences are actually better on all sides of the impact. So number one, longer sentences do not reduce crime. And if anything, they'll increase crime. Because as my partner said, when you're in prison for a long time, you get desensitized to it. And if anything, your mental health gets worse. And it has diminishing returns. Someone staying in prison for a long time is not going to think prison is worse and worse as they go along. Eventually they get used to it, and the length of it does not actually matter. Instead, since it's not even effective at deterring recidivism rates, we've provided logical evidence on why shorter sentences are actually better for everyone. One, these longer sentences have devastated low-income minority communities because they've lost generations of young men and women who are put in these unfair life sentences because of problems in the legal system. And even if the ineffectiveness or impacts on poor communities of color is not enough to revisit these lengthy prison sentences, the financial drain of long-term prisons are staggering. One, prison crowding is a horrible problem that only makes prisons worse, and this increases with long-term sentences. Our opponent said that this is negligible because if you take out long-term sentences, then people will still be in prison. But the reality is that long-term sentences are increasing. As I mentioned in my first speech, the amount of people in prison a couple decades ago is the same amount as just the people in prison serving life sentences today. These are only going to go up and become more prevalent in prisons and therefore contribute to prison crowding more because more people are serving life sentences. And the US prison spends $16 billion on elder care alone, billions of dollars that are devoted to prison care that could be going to something else. So this brings me to my third point. Our opponents basically say, in response to our prison crowding and more funds spent on prison, that the cost is negligible in terms of the US GDP. This may be true. This may be not a huge cost when you look at it in the entire US GDP, but this is $16 billion. We don't know what it's going to go to, but regardless of what it goes to, it's better spent than on elder care in prison. This could go to a variety of things, world hunger, foreign policy and security. It doesn't matter what it goes to, but $16 billion is enough to change an entire industry for the better. So therefore, their points that longer sentences are better completely falls to our logic that explains why shorter sentences are better for the prisoners themselves, prison systems, and people outside. And their point about prison crowding and more funds is not a big impact. I completely debunked that by saying it is a lot of money. So fourth, their second contention was that the death penalty is worse and that judges will have to choose between death penalty and lower sentences. So we agree completely, the death penalty is bad. But first of all, life without parole in prison is worse than the death penalty. It's very equivalent to the death penalty. You're keeping someone in prison until they die with no opportunity to come back for rehabilitation. This 25% of people sentenced to life sentences, that completely falls to us because none of our opponents' contentions apply to life without parole. That falls to us. Second, judges will not always choose the death penalty. Instead, they'll choose low sentences, which we have proven to be better. Shorter sentences are better than longer sentences. So obviously judges are going to choose them over the death penalty, which we agree is bad. So therefore, their entire contention too falls that the death penalty is worse because judges will not choose to use the death penalty. And then finally, our opponents say that it keeps rapists and murderers out of society and this cost is worth it. But my partner said that people age out. People kept in prison in life sentences are not always going to come back and harm society. So, Judge, if you believe in a world where prisoners have a better life because their contention to, or our contention to, that's inhumane for prisoners has flown throughout the entire debate. They haven't contested why it's not inhumane for prisoners. But for these reasons, we strongly vote a government ballot on this.
Great debate, guys. This was really
Great debate, guys. Thank you, guys.
Great
So much. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, judges.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to leave the room now, or are the judges gonna
You don't
give
have
feedback?
to. Theoretically, judges are supposed to disclose and give feedback once all 3 ballots are in. I'm not sure if the 3rd judge got the memo or if he's coming back later, but theoretically there will be like disclosure after we all decide. So y'all can just chill here and we will be back in some indeterminate period of time.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if we want to wait for that 3rd judge. I saw that there was a blast from tab room about disclosure and feedback, but I don't know if that means that he will be coming back. We do have a decision, and I at least can offer feedback, and the other judge who is currently still here may also be able to offer feedback. So hopefully that will be enough. Is everyone here? All right, so congratulations to both teams for breaking at the 2022 Berkeley High School Invitational. As was mentioned earlier on, this is one of the largest tournaments of the year, and with a field of more than 90 teams and a break to only 16, y'all have cleared one of the more difficult breaks to elim rounds that you'll face at any point in your career. So congratulations to all of you for making it to this round. However, only one team can advance, obviously. At the end of the debate, the decision is a 3-0 in favor of the negative team from the Menlo School. If Erica would like to give feedback, I can go after. Otherwise, I can just talk right now. We cannot hear you. Gotta love technical difficulties.
Hi, I have rejoined. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we have a bit of an echo. Apologies for that. Here are my comments, if I may go. And this is comments. I did vote for the opposition, given effective counter arguments that the majority of life sentences are actually with parole and that life sentences reduce crime. I thought the team successfully linked the societal impact, including perpetual racism, as a metric or a mirror of whether the prison or prison system, which is the agreed definition, is actually working. So great job to the opposition. I thought that was successfully argued. I'd like to provide additional comment for the opposition. Additionally, I would have personally liked to have seen a little bit more on the impact of removing life sentences. I thought that was going to be something quite strong as well. So I just want to raise that for feedback. That was a potential for further exploration, but great job overall. Very quickly, in regards to the Gov, I thought the burden in definition setup was well done. I thought the life in prison as worse than the death penalty was quite strong. Would have liked to seen this explored a little bit further in terms of economics and potentially using the opposition data point where they discussed older prisoners being less of a societal risk. So, in essence, older prisoners with a life sentence means someone is paying for something that's no longer a risk. I thought that might have been an angle to explore and strengthen. But again, excellent job to all debaters. Great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm just going to be basically reading off of my ballot, going through which issues I look to first in my decision-making process and where I ultimately land. First off, as like a sort of overview, I think that I don't really want to vote for the negative, because I think that at a thesis level, all of their arguments are correct, but they don't have the like warrants to back it up. I think that the argument that like prison is a deterrent is generally incorrect. If you look at the like literature comparing the punitive versus rehabilitative aspects of the carceral system, but within this round, I think that there's a lack of response to some of the key arguments of the neg. So first off, I look at the definitions, obviously, in order to figure out what matters and what is included in my decision calculus. I think that the neg is clearly in the right, as like the reason why life sentence without parole is a term of art is because most life sentences do include parole, probably at the 15 to 25 year. If I heard the MG correct, I may not have, but it sounded like your argument was that life without parole should be the definition because 25% of life sentences are life sentences without parole. But if I'm hearing that correctly, that means that 75% aren't. So I'm not sure if I just like wrote that down wrong or what. But without like a clearer warrant as to how life without parole is like uniquely like the majority of cases, it's probably better to just go with a broader definition. Next, I look to the issues of like cost and overcrowding, because I think that the responses that are given to both of these arguments are pretty cleanly extended by the affirmative by the negative, and both address the same sort of issue. I think that the AF needs to make clear articulations about how life sentences are particularly bad for overcrowding because of the sort of residual effect, where if you have a series of people that are sentenced to 10 to 15 years and then are released, then they essentially clear out space for future people who commit crimes. But if you have life sentences, then you have to either build additional capacity or you start to have this overcrowding issue. The state of California in particular had a lot of problems with this under our previous 3 strikes law before Proposition, I believe, 38 reformed sentencing guidelines at the state level. And I think that given the statistics in the round, it sounds like if everyone who currently has a life sentence were released, it would only reduce the prison population by approximately 10%, which means that the arguments about cost and overcrowding aren't really solved by the idea of getting rid of the prison. I think that the elder care argument is probably something that is unique to life sentences. You could have, as Erica was saying about how you can talk about how they're, uniquely not a risk to society. The idea of someone who's like 70 or 80 years old receiving elder care through the prison system is a unique artifact of life sentences because the vast majority of people don't commit crimes when they're already like 60 or 65, right? The thing is that because they are essentially a burden on the state because of their status as incarcerated, this is a unique amount of money that could go to something good. That being said, I don't think that y'all are able to fiat that the money would go to something good. So for example, it could go towards education, but it could just as easily go to more tax breaks for Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, or to giving cluster bombs to fundamentalist absolute monarchies, as we want to do in this country. Finally, the main argument that I make my decision on is the double bind on the second neg contention. The two scenarios that are given it's not technically like a double bind because both of these can occur simultaneously. If you get rid of the option of life sentencing, some judges will give lighter sentences and some judges will give the death penalty, right? The negative articulates through multiple warrants that in addition to the way that sentencing in general is racist and prejudiced, capital punishment in particular has a huge racial bias, both in terms of who the perpetrator and who the victim are, in terms of who is and is not sentenced to death. And the only defensive argument I have here from the affirmative is that judges will, as logical, rational actors, will tend towards giving lighter sentences. But I think that given the articulations that the neg is making about how capital punishment works in the status quo, you can't really presume that. So I think that the scenario where a bunch of prisoners of color are executed who otherwise would not have been is probably pretty damning. And secondly, it is also simultaneously possible that in some instances where judges give more lenient sentences, prisoners will get out and then reoffend who would not otherwise, because if they, according to the statistics given, if you have a life sentence with the possibility of parole, your recidivism rate is something like 20 times lower than the average population. As a concluding note, I think that this round and some of those statistics that I've highlighted already demonstrate how bad the NPDL online round rule that bans citations is, because it forces judges to take any numbers asserted in round at face value without allowing the debaters the opportunity to indict sources or analyze the validity of the numbers that are being given in their context, or even understand what source they're coming from in order to contextualize them. Citations create better debate and better education, and that's my little rant since I had the opportunity. But I think that both teams did a good job. And I think that y'all each argued for your side in a way that makes strategic sense at a high level. It's just a question of how things ultimately land when you give the sort of comparison of impacts and warrants that went on in this round.
Thank you.
Thank you, judges.
Thank you.